Hey everyone, this is chapter 1 of The History of the Left from Marx to the Present, Theoretical Perspectives by Darrrow Schecter. Marx's writings can be roughly divided into three periods. The first is characterized by his grappling with the philosophies of Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804, and Hegel, who lived from 1770 to 1831. The second is marked by a turn away from his concentration on philosophy and a transition to the detailed study of politics and economics. The third is the period of maturity in which Marx wove together all the various strands of his thinking, writing the Grundrisse in 1857 and 1858, as well as the 3 volumes of Capital, which, along with the Communist Manifesto of 1848, is perhaps his most famous work. In terms of Marx's prodigious output as a whole, it is often remarked that the system he develops is derived from 3 principal sources. These sources are German idealist philosophy, Kant and Hegel, French utopian socialism, Fourier and Saint-Simon, and English and Scottish-British political economy, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, Douglas Stewart, and David Ricardo. It will be seen below that another key figure from the first period, Ludwig Feuerbach, who lived from 1804 to 1872, provides him with the tools that he needs to criticize Hegel in a specifically materialist direction, and that the shift in emphasis from idealism and anthropology to historical materialism has a tremendous impact on Marx's project as a whole. This shift should not be misunderstood as a radical break, however, for there is a fundamental continuity between the young Marx on philosophy and politics and the mature Marx on sociology and political economy. What emerges across the 3 periods is a many-sided but ultimately very coherently synthesized critique of religion, philosophy, law, political economy, and the state. In terms of the themes in this chapter, the first period is the most important for 2 principal reasons, which elucidate the trajectory of the left in Europe from Marx to the present. Firstly, and most importantly, in grappling with the ideas of Kant, Hegel, and Feuerbach, Marx takes up a line of inquiry that is pursued in different ways by the theorists of Western Marxism and critical theory in the interwar period and again in the 1960s. In the subsequent decades of the 20th century, this line of Hegelian Marxist inquiry is substantially revised by some of the post-structuralists as a result of the incorporation of selected ideas from the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived from 1844 to 1900, into their social theory. Following Marx, the leading representatives of Western Marxism, critical theory, and post-structuralism explored the idea that the critique of epistemology, i.e., the ways in which we know, is implicitly and at times explicitly also a critique of the society in which we live and of the way we conceive of the relation between theory and practice. Secondly, while Marx's oeuvre can be seen to culminate in his mature writings on political economy, the critique of political economy is ultimately a development of the theory of historical materialism, and the latter is itself a development of the critique of idealism and Hegel's theories of subjective and objective spirit. Hence, this chapter begins with a brief excursus on Kant, Hegel, and Feuerbach, and then moves on to examine Marx's attempt to project epistemology beyond traditional philosophy in theory, while projecting economics and politics beyond capitalism and the democratic parliamentary state in practice. The precursors: Kant, Hegel, and Feuerbach. At the core of Kant's critical philosophy is an attempt to rescue epistemological inquiry from a cul-de-sac. He starts from the intuition that the attempt to explain the knowledge process by relying on the primacy of mind or human consciousness, variously defended by rationalists such as Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, is as questionable as the empiricist primacy of nature espoused in different ways by Berkeley, Locke, and Hume. The impasse reached by the diametrically opposed positions taken up by these two schools leads Kant to say that the question as to whether knowledge is to be sought in humanity, mind, or in nature, the world external to the mind, is falsely posed, just as the fundamental question of whether we have knowledge or merely whims and opinions is falsely posed. He maintains that framing the key questions of epistemology in this way results in a standoff between rationalist knowledge, which is monolithic and dogmatic, because all minds must be the same, and empiricist knowledge, which is arbitrary and relativist, because there is potentially unlimited versions of individual experience with no way to adjudicate between their different claims. Kant asserts that the choice between dogmatism and relativism is highly unsatisfactory and in any case inadequate to the challenges of enlightenment and modernity. Hence he attempts to rescue epistemological investigation from the rationalist versus empiricist dilemma by arguing that the real question is not whether or not we have knowledge or if knowledge is to be sought in consciousness or in nature. The more pertinent question is, under what conditions is knowledge possible? In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant identifies the condition of possible knowledge as the existence of a transcendental subject that can reflexively unify itself with reason, and thereby have formal knowledge of the phenomenon that present themselves to the 12 categories of the understanding: causality, unity, plurality, possibility, necessity, substance, etc., in time and space. We furnish a critique of, quote, pure, end quote, reason, in furnishing a critique of, quote, pure, end quote, reason, Kant is arguing that though we can have formal knowledge of the phenomenon of perception that is objective, we cannot have essential knowledge of the noumena, the things in themselves, unmediated by conceptual form, that is absolute. Against a rationalist understanding of the relationship between humanity and nature, which is dualistic, and an empiricist understanding of that relation that can be described as the identity of humanity and nature, Kant reintroduces the Greek emphasis on dialectics into philosophy. In other words, rationalists posit a dualism between humanity and nature due to the existence of the human mind, while empiricists posit an identity between mind and nature based on the idea that the mind is a natural organ. According to a more dialectical understanding, dualism and identity are both inadequate, since humanity is itself part of nature, because of the simple reality of hunger, thirst, birth, and mortality, etc., though not reducible to nature because of consciousness and our ability to reflexively unify ourselves with reason. The dialectical approach, which was adopted in different ways by Hegel and Marx and subsequently taken up in a more critical vein by later figures on the European left, such as Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, and Jean-Paul Sartre, attempts to think in harmony with the paradox that humanity is located both inside and outside nature. Hence, whilst dualistic and identity approaches tend to be analytical and static, the dialectical approach recognizes that thinking is moved by contradiction and tension because the world itself is comprised of a dynamic totality of contradictory and at times opposing forces. Hence, for dialectical thinkers trying to ascertain the bases of knowledge, it is the forms of mediation between humanity and nature that count, and they reject attempts to establish an essential primacy of the human mind or of nature. Whether the thinkers in question acknowledge it or not, however, this way of looking at reality is initiated by Kant. One of the central questions for all thinkers after Kant is how to conceive of the mediation between humanity and nature without making what they take to be the Kantian error of assigning permanent validity to the two forms of sensible intuition, space and time, and the 12 categories of the understanding. Kant posits an insurmountable limit to reason and what we can know by insisting that we cannot know the things in themselves. Many of the thinkers on the left who will be considered in this book pursue the question, might not a different society be capable of producing more perfect forms of mediation and as a result more perfect forms of reason and freedom? Modern dialectical thinking becomes historical when Hegel discovers that the forms of reasoning mediating between humanity and nature are in a process of constant unfolding and are never at rest for long. Indeed, it is Hegel's implicit claim that, while moving philosophy beyond the dualist and identity approaches, Kant's philosophy is not dialectical enough precisely because Kant's philosophy is not sufficiently historical. For Hegel, it is not enough to realize that the relationship between humanity and nature is mediated. If one stops there, one runs the risk of settling for the idea that humanity and nature are forever separated by the mediating processes in a manner analogous to the separation of form and content, or essences and appearances. It is Hegel's contention that Kant does just this, by categorically separating the phenomenon and the forms of our knowledge from the noumena and the objects of our knowledge themselves. From Hegel's standpoint, Kant forgets that, in addition to being mediated, the relation between humanity and nature is dialectical. Kant also forgets that it is inherent in the notion of historicized dialectics that the mediation processes reach successively higher and more complete resolutions as history progresses. Hegel sees this happening in a movement from unmediated unity, thesis, to mediated disunity, antithesis, to mediated unity, synthesis. This is a movement that he believes culminates in absolute knowledge at the level of the individual subject. In a parallel development, the same movement results in the achievement of absolute freedom at the level of world history. The theory of individual knowledge is outlined as a theory of what Hegel calls, quote, subjective spirit, end quote, in the Phenomenology of Spirit of 1807. In The Philosophy of Right, published in 1821, and in the Lectures on the Philosophy of World History from 1830, Hegel develops his theory of history as the unfolding of what he refers to as objective spirit. As will be seen presently, Hegel's theories of subjective spirit and objective spirit mark a decisive break with Kant, and at the same time clearly foreshadow Marx's particular approach to dialectics and his explanation of historical change and political revolution. For the time being, one might say that Hegel regards history as the story of spirit's journey from unmediated unity to mediated unity, traveled along a difficult and winding succession of progressively more perfect stages of mediated disunity. This idea is briefly explained below. In terms of subjective spirit, Hegel imagines that humanity once enjoyed a relationship of unmediated unity with nature, which was broken, or to anticipate Feuerbach and Marx, alienated, in the realization that consciousness is always consciousness of something foreign to one's own consciousness. At some point in history, people become acutely aware that this, quote, something, end quote, is no longer identical with consciousness, but rather an entity external and hostile to consciousness. From that stage in the development of consciousness onward, subjective consciousness perceives the relationship with the objects of consciousness as mediated disunity. Although they are no longer united in identity, consciousness and the objects of consciousness are nonetheless united in the dynamic identity of subject and object, and the corresponding perception that there can be no subject without an object and vice versa. As such, subject and object, like humanity and nature, constitute a totality. So even if the terms of the totality are not identical, dogmatism, they are nonetheless not dualistically separated, relativism/positivism. That is, that in spite of their non-identity, a form of mediated unity is operative in the relation between subject and object, and between consciousness and nature. This is part of what is meant to think dialectically about humanity's paradoxical location in the world. Mediation processes unite not knowing subjects, 1, and known objects, 2, at the same time that they separate. The paradoxical dimension that unites as well as separates is mediates, is what Hegel refers to as spirit. A temporary form of mediated unity is achieved when consciousness adjusts the concepts and categories it adopts in order better to grasp the objective quality of the object of perception. But before long, mediated unity gives way to mediated disunity again as consciousness perceives that the concepts and categories invoked to understand objective reality are deficient and in need of further adjustment. In Hegel's estimation, Kant implies that there is an inevitable stalemate between subjective consciousness and objective reality that precludes the possibility of pure reason and knowledge of objects without the mediation of conceptual form. Hegel is thus determined to move philosophy beyond Kant's static conception of mediation and beyond what he considers to be Kant's inadequate conception of epistemological form. It's raining, I guess you noticed. Anyway, for Hegel, actually, that's a. Sorry about that. For Hegel, Kant's great achievement is that he shows that all objective knowledge is mediated by the 12 subjective categories of the understanding. I.e., he shows that all objectivity is mediated by subjectivity. Hegel takes the argument further by showing that all subjectivity is mediated by objectivity. In this context, what Hegel means by, quote, objectivity is the historical evolution of social and political institutions. It is the ongoing contradiction between subjective consciousness and the concepts developed to explain objective historical reality, thesis on the one hand, and the actual historical reality as it is really operative at any particular time in real institutions, antithesis. On the other, that always indicates that the concepts invoked to explain reality are in need of further revision in order to become even more real. Synthesis. Another way of expressing this idea is that subjectivity is historically created, superseded and recreated as a result of changing conditions of objectivity and the unfolding of objective spirit in ever-new socio-political institutions that produce qualitatively new, more perfectly knowing subjects at every stage of the historical process. Thus, Hegel attempts to show that all subjectivity in the guise of consciousness is mediated by objectivity in the guise of history and society. From that moment on, Hegel submits one cannot convincingly rely on the notion of 12 fixed categories of the understanding, nor can one rely on some static conception of, quote, human nature, or, quote, the human condition. Humans are products of nature as well as products of history, and history in particular has a dynamic structure that tends towards overcoming the limits on knowledge at the same time as tending towards overcoming the limits on freedom. This theory of objective spirit is systematically developed in the philosophy of right. In the prologue, Hegel says that the actually existing world is rational, and that the rational is what actually exists. There are two closely related consequences that follow. First, there can be no credible Kantian juxtaposition between what is, in terms of ethics and morality, and what ought to be in terms of politics and the state. What is and what ought to be might seem like discrepant realities, but for Hegel they are in fact in a process of slow but inexorable convergence. This analysis points to the second consequence, which is that all of reality can be understood as a mediated totality of humanity and nature, in which the structure of the mediations is knowable. It is a rational configuration of mediating concepts that is gradually uniting mind, subjective spirit, with institutions, objective spirit, over the course of the historical process. The theory of objective spirit in the philosophy of right thus brings philosophical idealism to a culminating point of no return, which, as will be shown in the rest of this chapter, Marx seeks to transcend with his ideas on historical materialism and revolution. To anticipate the argument, Marx sees the motor of historical change in a series of contradictions between our human capacity to transform the natural world through creative labor power, on the one hand, and the legal, political, ideological, and cultural impediments to the full development of that productive capacity on the other. Hence, for Marx, it is not the contradictions within the movement of spirit that mediate between humanity and nature, but rather human labor power. This means that Hegel is absolutely right in his objections to Kant, but is also right to insist on the dialectical nature of reality. But for Marx, Hegel is wrong to suppose that the mainspring of dialectics is consciousness. This raises several questions which will be revisited later in this book. While he resolutely criticizes Hegel, it is also clear that to a significant extent, Marx adopts key aspects of the structure of Hegel's epistemology to his own epistemological and political program. Does Marxism in particular, and the left in general, need to be even more resolute in challenging Hegelian thought? Or does Hegelian thought, on the contrary, offer a political and epistemological possibilities that are not fully recognized as a result of Marx's haste to dispense with Hegel and idealism? Does Marx exaggerate the centrality of technology and labor in the mediation of humanity and nature? It will be seen in Chapter 2 that Western Marxism arises as a response to technologically deterministic and economically mechanical interpretations of Marx, and their manifest incapacity to explain historical phenomena such as working-class nationalism during World War I and fascism. Dissatisfaction with the explanatory inadequacy on the part of the mechanical and evolutionary modes of Marxism leads the theorists of Western Marxism to reconsider relations between the economic base and the legal, cultural, political, and aesthetic superstructure. Before moving on to these discussions, it is therefore imperative to clarify Marx's relation to Hegel. In his exposition of the theory of ethical life in the third section of the Philosophy of Right, Hegel argues that the movement from unmediated unity to mediated disunity to mediated unity at the level of subjective spirit finds its parallel in the movement from the family to civil society and from there to the state at the level of objective spirit. Prior to Hegel, modern legal and political philosophy from Hobbes to Kant, attempts to formulate the conditions of political obligation in secular terms by explaining, albeit in substantially different ways, why and how the free individuals existing in the state of nature unanimously agree to abandon their natural advantages in order to form a civil society. Thus, before Hegel, the state of nature is juxtaposed to civil society, and the latter term is synonymous with the state. Hegel abandons the state of nature versus civil society dichotomy for his tripartite system of mediations because, among other reasons, he is determined to give the state a firmer foundation than his predecessors, who generally rely on different versions of the idea of a social contract. Social contract theorists posit that individuals leave the state of nature by making a contract with the state that guarantees their rights in a more stable form than would be possible without the state. The state of nature is sometimes depicted as violent, as in Hobbes. It is also described in more consensual and peaceful terms, as in Locke and Rousseau. In all cases, however, contract is regarded as the medium through which the modern state can be seen to be founded on a fundamental form of unanimous agreement rather than force, the divine right of kings, tradition, or some other specious argument. It is clear to the social contract theorist that agreement must underpin secular forms of modern authority. Arguments in favor of the divine right of kings are no longer tenable given the trajectory of political thought and action since the appearance of Renaissance republicanism and humanism in the 15th and 16th centuries. While Hegel agrees that modern authority must be based on rational agreement rather than divine right, aristocratic privilege, tradition, force, etc., he is nonetheless certain that this agreement cannot be based on the model of individual interest and contract. Hegel explains that it is futile to attempt to derive the terms of political obligation from a contractual model, since a valid contract presupposes a valid state, which makes a contract binding in the first place. In other words, the difference between ownership and mere possession is law and state, in a manner analogous to the movement from unmediated unity to mediated unity by way of mediated disunity, and corresponding to the idea that all subjectivity is mediated by institutional objectivity. Hegel argues that it is actually the substantive and non-contractual forms of agreement that make the contractual dimension based on interest and contract possible. Universality and legitimate authority make particularity and the pursuit of interest possible, and in fact dictate the terms under which the latter may be pursued, not the other way around. Hegel is confident that the fabric of the modern state is particularly strong and elastic, since it can assimilate and harmonize a great many particularist and individualist threads. To this extent, he concurs with social contract theorists who argue that individual rights and interests are a key component of modern consciousness. He also has a certain amount of sympathy with the ideas voiced by a number of his contemporaries who would like to see the Greek polis resurrected in order to recreate a form of unmediated unity between the individual citizen and the political community. But such, quote, creations, end quote, however desirable they might seem, are in fact arbitrary inventions in the course of spirit's long journey towards self-discovery and mediated unity. An attempt to recreate unmediated unity between the citizen and the state is bound to fail, for it fails to acknowledge the moment of truth in particularity, conflict, and divergence, i.e. in institutionalized forms of mediated disunity that are characteristic of modern civil societies and the struggles for mutual recognition within modern civil societies. In the section of the philosophy of right dedicated to the role of the corporation within civil society, Hegel implicitly warns that attempts to eradicate contractualized pluralism and associational life embodied by churches, universities, guilds, competition, commerce, etc. is bound to fail. After the experiences of Christianity, the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and the nascent industrial revolution of his own day, it was clear to Hegel that it is not possible for us to return to ancient Greece and the forms of politics that flourished there. Moreover, the episode of the Terror in the French Revolution indicates that political projects designated to create unmediated unity between citizen and state will result in tyranny. In terms of the complicated relation between consciousness, theory, and institutions practice, therefore, it might be that Hegel is in a position to enter into a critical dialogue with those who preceded him, such as Robespierre and the Jacobins, as well as those who came after him, such as Lenin and the Bolsheviks. He implies that despite all the many problems in the civil sphere, any attempt to incorporate civil society and the state in the name of the general will and a resolution of the tension between equality of citizenship and inequality between classes is destined to fail. Marx, by contrast, is sure that history does not stop with the French Revolution and the modern state. He thinks that, far from resting on a fundamental form of agreement, the modern state represents the political compromise resulting from the conflicts arising between, on the one hand, waning feudal aristocratic power based on land ownership, and on the other, ascendant bourgeois industrial power based on the ownership of capital. Rather than being an expression of unmediated unity, the state is largely an expression of mediated disunity, institutionalized as bourgeois industrial power, which can, in its turn, be criticized and overthrown. Like Hegel, Marx is sure that mediated unity is inscribed within the unfolding of history. This means that for both thinkers, a harmonious community between humanity and nature and between humanity and other humanity is a historical inevitability. Unlike Hegel, Marx refuses to regard the arrival of the modern state as the last stage of that process. To begin with, Marx does not share Hegel's confidence in the capacity of the modern state to bear the strains of associated pluralism and forms of commercial exchange predicated on contractually mediated individual and class interest. However, the path of inquiry that leads Marx to this conclusion and beyond to his theory of historical materialism and the critique of political economy begins with a critique of religion. This is a critique in which Feuerbach's concepts of species being, alienation, and fetishism play a key role. Feuerbach develops his ideas on these subjects in detail in The Essence of Christianity, published in 1841. Here he anticipates Nietzsche's critique of religion by arguing that in attributing humanity's best characteristics to God in heaven, humanity itself becomes incapable of unifying theory and practice on earth. For Feuerbach, there is an answer to why humanity is largely neither happy nor free, and is decidedly not original sin or some other curse of nature or God. To the extent that God is said to be omniscient, omnipotent, creative, loving, and forgiving, humanity becomes ignorant, weak, unimaginative, petty, and vengeful. In this process, people take what rightfully belongs to the human species and they alienate it to some kind of deity. That is, the creation of God consists in a series of steps in which humans defer the earthly realization of their own freedom, happiness, and creativity by projecting that realization onto an already perfect being who exists in another world. Projection results in passivity and conformity instead of active, world-transforming practice. What makes this process difficult to criticize and to change is that what begins as an array of human qualities comes back to humanity in a form that human beings no longer recognize as human. This can be explained with a look at Feuerbach's twin critique of religious thinking in Hegelian philosophy. One must bear in mind that Hegel regards history in terms analogous to a journey in which the spirit mediating humanity and nature experiences first unity, then loss, then unity again on a higher, more richly articulated plane. Feuerbach interprets Hegelian philosophy as a rather inconclusive break from religious thinking. He observes that by reasoning in terms of spirit's journey towards self-discovery, Hegel endows thought itself with a life independent of humanity and individual thinking humans. The journey of spirit attains a kind of otherworldly quality that is at odds with sensuous, practical, and earthly realities. As a consequence of Hegel's garbled terminology, philosophical thinking about this journey becomes opaque and wrapped up in its own closed system of abstract concepts and categories. By the time one has read it, one forgets that it is the result of active creative thinking because it seems to come from another world. It is not important whether one accepts it as dogmatic truth or dismisses it as wholly foreign and unintelligible. More crucially, one forgets that it is the product of the mind of an intelligent man with physical needs, material hopes, sentiments of love, and so forth. Feuerbach suggests that there is nothing fundamentally alienating about philosophy or religion unless we forget that they have their common origins in the struggle of humanity to understand its relation with nature. Taking the case of religion, one sees that in theory, religious thought teaches us about love, kindness, forgiveness, and hope. But when we are confronted with the rules, codes, organized hierarchies, and punitive sanctions of existing religious institutions, God and religion appear to humans as something strange, terrifying, and otherworldly. In the end, humans no longer recognize a product of their own earthly existence and imagination in religion. Religion becomes a phenomenon created by an alien being or deity to which humans must submit. Feuerbach credits Hegel with the insight that history develops in stages and that the institutional results, Hegel's objective spirit at every stage, are increasingly complex and rich in possibilities for knowledge and freedom. However, Feuerbach thinks that Hegel gives us a theological account of history in philosophical language that obscures the anthropological fact that both philosophy and religion are the results of human interpretations of history and society. Hegel perpetuates rather than solves the problem that when we grapple with theological and philosophical systems, we all too often lose sight of our own mental activity and imagination in them. Philosophies and religions can then assume the objective form of doctrines and institutions that command deference and obedience. Marx interprets Feuerbach's critique of Hegel to mean that the critique of religion and the critique of philosophy are related enterprises. Not only are humanity and nature and subject and object dialectically mediated in history, as are theory and practice. Hence, Marx acknowledges the importance of Feuerbach's critique of Hegel, but hastens to add that by placing sensuous and thinking humanity at the center of reality, instead of philosophers and priests, Feuerbach offers an ultimately anodyne form of anthropological humanism in place of organized religion and academic philosophy. He does not show or explain what kinds of institutions and relations between people must obtain if there is to be a truly humanized world. From Marx's perspective, revolutionary practice must supersede religion, philosophy, and Feuerbach's brand of generic humanism. What Marx proposes in his early writings of 1843, and particularly in the critique of Hegel and on the Jewish question, is to think through the questions raised by Feuerbach in relation to Hegel by retaining Hegel's dialectical method and infusing Hegel's dialectical method with the revolutionary materialism implicitly suggested by Feuerbach's anthropological humanism. Marx seeks to do this by transferring Feuerbach's critique of Hegel to the domains of the state, law, politics, and from there to political economy and the labor process. While retaining the dialectic in Hegel, Marx retains Feuerbach's genealogical notion that ideas and practices start out in one institutional form and subtly evolve towards a different form. Ideas and practices then return to actual citizens in a new institutional form in a series of stages that over time tend to become opaque to most of the participants in the historical process. This makes the power relations governing the historical process appear unfathomable and unchangeable. On the basis of his reading of Feuerbach, the young Marx argues that humans create religious systems and forms of authority that enslave their minds and find their real terrestrial expression in the power of the church hierarchy over concrete individuals. But he takes a decisive step further by explaining that something analogous happens in our political and socioeconomic institutions. In the writings of 1843 to 45, Marx traces the social mechanisms in which human relations, which are always capable of being reformed or even revolutionized, acquire the objective institutional form of relations that are unchangeable, either because they are natural or because they are things that are not of our own creation to which we must submit. While Kant proves that consciousness is neither identical with nature nor wholly separate from nature, and Hegel proves that consciousness is modified by history and determinate forms of society, the young Marx sets out to prove that it is within humanity's power to liberate itself from all forms of consciousness and social relations that reduce its individual members to passive roles in the hierarchies operative in the church, state, and civil society. As will be seen in the course of his analysis, Marx locates the economy as the key to understanding civil society and the state. Marx on fetishism, reification, and the difference between political emancipation and human emancipation. The tendency to attribute natural and otherworldly properties to human creations and relations is a phenomenon Marx calls fetishism. He diagnoses a related problem in the tendency to attribute thing-like qualities to human creations and relations, which he calls reification. The question of reification and reified consciousness is taken up in detail by a number of influential Western Marxist and critical theorists, as will be seen in chapters 2 and 3. For now, it is important to note that systematic reflections on these topics appear for the first time in the Critique of Hegel and on the Jewish Question. They are then developed further in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. In the introduction to the Critique of Hegel, one reads the now famous lines about religion being the opiate of the masses. Marx goes on to explain that the critique of reified social, political, and economic relations must begin in his native Germany as a critique of religion and philosophy, since historically speaking, Germany is less advanced in the field of industrial production than other countries, most notably England. He is already thinking along lines that will recur in the works of the next few years, such as the German ideology and the Communist Manifesto, that the economically most developed countries indicate to the lesser developed ones their future course of development. This process can take unusual turns, making the key issue appear to be religion in one place, philosophy in another, and politics in a third. Marx suggests that what must be grasped in dialectical fashion is the notion of the totality of mediations, even if at any particular historical juncture in a given country its religion, philosophy, or politics may appear the most visible point of social conflict and political rupture. The best way to understand the totality of mediations is still somewhat unclear in Marx in 1843, though he says that what it means to be radical is to take a problem by the root. This implies that behind the religious, philosophical, artistic, and political disputes of a time and place, there is a primary key of interpretation. At this stage, however, Marx is still defining his own position in relation to the ideas of Hegel and Feuerbach. 2 points emerge in the introduction to the Critique of Hegel. The first appears with Marx's demand that, quote, the criticism of religion ends with the doctrine that for man the supreme being is man, and thus with the categorical imperative to overthrow all conditions in which man is a debased, neglected, and contemptible being, end quote. Marx follows these remarks at the end of the introduction, where he talks about a class that is the dissolution of all classes, a sphere that has a universal character because of its universal suffering, which lays claim to no particular right, because the wrong it suffers is not a particular wrong, but a wrong in general. He then announces the appearance of a social class that, precisely because it represents the total loss of humanity, bears within itself the possibility of the total redemption of humanity. It is striking that Marx remains under Hegel's influence to the extent that the process preparing the emancipation of humanity is seen to be preceded by a stage of total loss and alienation, but in contrast to Hegel and many of the thinkers who will be examined in this book, he is firmly committed to revolution. For Marx, the only way to answer philosophical questions about reality, knowledge, and freedom is to put theory into practice. He likens this transformation to making philosophy redundant by realizing philosophy in practice. Just as the critique of religion must give way to the critique of social relations that give rise to religious institutions, for Marx the critique of philosophy must give way to a radical reorganization of the institutions that encourage people to understand the real material problems in their lives in abstractly philosophical terms. This line of argument is pursued further in On the Jewish Question, in which Marx turns his attention to that particular aspect of Hegel's philosophy that fascinates him most in 1843 to 45. This is Hegel's marked departure from the social contract theorist and his corresponding theories of the state and civil society. Following Feuerbach, Marx reasons that just as humans create God, religion, and the material conditions that give rise to religious penitence instead of active transformation, so too do humans create law and the state. As in the case of church hierarchy, law and the state confront the citizens as alien institutions that dominate the very people who brought them into existence. To the extent that the state is imagined to be a communitarian, democratic, transcendent of particular interest and the embodiment of freedom, the citizens in civil society are compelled to understand themselves as engaged in egotistic, undemocratic, and competitive pursuits. The capacity of self-government, which at least in theory starts with the autonomous citizen, is unconsciously bestowed upon the state by the citizens. The state then seems like an objective phenomenon with its own objective imperatives and rights against the citizens. Like God, the state becomes a reified entity that inspires incomprehension and fear. Citizens forget that the capacity for democracy and freedom is their capacity, because in the state they are confronted with alienated institutions that they no longer recognize as the result of their own activity. For Marx, this is a disastrous situation which Hegel consciously seeks to defend in the philosophy of right by declaring state institutions to be the bearers of mediated unity. In On the Jewish Question, Marx recognizes the profundity of Hegel's critique of the social contract theorist as well as his diagnosis of the separation of the state and civil society as a key feature of the structure of modern industrial countries. He goes on to explain that the real issue involved in the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, and his polemic with the young Hegelian Bruno Bauer is that text is not the political enfranchisement, in that text, is not the political enfranchisement of the Jewish population or European nation states. The real issue is political enfranchisement or emancipation versus more universal human emancipation for everyone, not just the Jewish members of the state. What is meant by this distinction between political and human emancipation? Marx did not belittle the struggle for Jewish enfranchisement. He uses the example of the struggle in order to make the point that the key to the emancipation of the Jewish people is not their political emancipation, but the emancipation of the state from Judaism. That is, the more the state can portray itself as a neutral state that makes no distinctions between Christians and non-Christians, the more it can be seen to be impartial and neutral. It is then the entire people's state, a democratic state, not the Christian state, Jewish state, or any other state championing particular interests. It attains true universality and appears to embody Hegelian mediated unity. Marx is always aware of the pitfalls of fetishism and reification. Accordingly, he implies that the term, quote, state, like the term, quote, capital, in his later analyses, denotes a relation rather than a thing to be seized, smashed, or occupied. When Marx speaks of the emancipation of the state from Judaism, or from any other religion for that matter, what he means is that the relations of power in society are in constant process of reorganization and redeployment. At a particular historical moment, it may well be that the advancement of determinate power interest requires a legitimating discourse, and it is characteristic of modern societies that the exercise of power becomes increasingly detached from visibly identifiable figures such as kings, queens, and the nobility. In emancipating itself from religion, the network of power relations and interests denoted by the word, quote, state becomes even more of an abstraction to the citizen than it is when the state is directly identified with one religion or a definite set of rulers. The process that runs parallel to the state declaring itself the embodiment and guarantor of reason and universality is that the citizens become passive recipients of universal human rights. In theory, all people, regardless of race, religion, class, and other distinctions, are henceforth proclaimed equal, and political emancipation becomes synonymous with human emancipation. Marx suggests that what is really happening is that the arrival of this particular form of political emancipation is tantamount to the realization of a new right kind of religiosity in the fetishizing of law, property, and human rights. It is true that the restructuring of the state in order to make religion a personal matter allows citizens across different denominations to practice their religions, but it simultaneously becomes difficult to see that along with religion, the real obstacles to a credible form of universality are becoming private and increasingly unaccountable to public authority. What Marx means by the, quote, real obstacles, end quote, is of course property and capitalist forms of exchange based on production for profit rather than need or intrinsic creativity. One is in fact tempted to say that the first analyses of what is today referred to as globalization in terms of the power of private economic interests to elude public and political accountability are actually implicitly contained in the 1843 writings. Chapter 6 and the conclusion will take up this point. By granting religious emancipation, Marx explains, humans are not freed from religion, they are granted religious freedom. The more important result is that they are not freed from the social relation denoted by the term, quote, property, end quote. They are granted freedom to acquire as much property as they like if they can. Marx uses the issue of religious emancipation in order to analyze a more fundamental development in the evolution of different forms of state. He traces the process by which the modern state, far from being universal or neutral and far from reconciling clashing particular interests as Hegel claims it does, actually secures the bases of newly emerging interests of a very specific kind which are in the process of emancipating themselves from feudal political control. Hence, Marx is convinced that the French Revolution is much more than a French affair. It marks the transition from the feudal aristocratic epoch to the bourgeois democratic epoch in Europe, North America, and eventually on a global scale. He has no doubt that the defeats of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1812-13 and the partial restoration of hereditary power in places such as Italy therefore would be only small parentheses in the otherwise inexorable movement of history towards more perfect forms of freedom and knowledge. However epochal in scope, the movement for political emancipation inaugurated by the French Revolution is nonetheless crucially limited. This is the gist of Marx's critique of Hegel and the argument developed on the Jewish question. The revolution proclaims the sovereignty of the citizenry as well as the right of man and citizen. However, Marx objects, if the citizens were really sovereign, there would be no separation between them and the machinery of government. Political emancipation guarantees each citizen's right not to be infringed upon in the private sphere in which they gain their livelihood. In framing freedom in this way, each individual has the negative freedom not to be infringed upon in the buying and selling of property. In effect, this means they have the freedom necessary to secure the conditions under which the interests of private property become synonymous with general interests. Prior to the French Revolution, guilds, estates, and various kinds of corporations in civil society performed the mediating function between individual and state assigned to them at the theoretical level by Hegel. The events in France signify the culminating point of a process in which the authority of these mediating institutions is gradually undermined. According to Marx, civil society increasingly becomes a depoliticized battlefield of struggling individuals and classes, whilst the state becomes an increasingly centralized and distant form of largely symbolic political authority. It is largely symbolic authority, he argues, because real authority is dispersed in power networks in civil society. This diagnosis prompts Marx to say, in On the Jewish Question, that, quote, political emancipation was at the same time the emancipation of civil society from politics, from its even having a semblance of a universal content, end quote. While Hegel is confident that the associational life of the corporations provides a kind of pre-state level form of organization that involves citizens in semi-political pursuits beyond the struggle for survival, Marx regards this as a quickly diminishing institutional reality in the individualist age of the rights of man and citizen. Marx does not yearn for a return to the age of guilds and corporations, for this was what he calls, in the critique of Hegel, the, quote, democracy of unfreedom, end quote. Moreover, as will be seen in the next section, he is also persuaded that the demise of associational corporatism and the rise of bourgeois individualism will result in an increase in humanity's productive capacity on an entirely unprecedented scale. This productive capacity prepares the ground for the, quote, democracy of freedom, end quote, by emancipating people from the various forms of physical necessity and material scarcity that have shackled the imagination to the daily grind of winning the battle of survival. The immediate task in the early writings, then, is fully to grasp the processes leading to the restructuring of power relations that brings about the formation of the modern state. An analysis of these processes will offer the key to understanding what more legitimate forms of political community might in their turn replace the newly established institutions of bourgeois power. Marx interprets the advent of political emancipation in terms of two important developments. First, modern economic institutions are given an individualist basis on the foundation provided by formal legal equality in general and by civil law in particular. The first consequence is that various forms of serfdom are abolished, not until 1861 in Russia, in favor of the contractual right to buy and sell labor as a good or commodity. The second consequence is that the state emerges as a powerful and largely politically unaccountable force reigning in the name of a spurious general interest on behalf of particular interests linked with contract exchange and the sale and accumulation of capital and property. In view of these tendencies, Marx is at first skeptical of and soon after categorically opposed to the idea of a parliamentary solution to the divorce between the state and civil society. He begins to see that economic interest related to property and exchange cannot have a basis separate from political and community interest in a truly legitimate democratic polity. Hence the question arises, what does Marx envisage as an alternative to political emancipation and the negation and the negative forms of liberty guaranteed by parliamentary democracy? Toward the end of On the Jewish Question, he affirms, quote, only when man has recognized and organized, quote, his forces propres, end quote, own powers of social forces, and consequently no longer separates social power from himself in the shape of political power, only then will human emancipation have been accomplished, end quote. When he does not specify exactly what he has in mind while he does not specify exactly what he has in mind by this in institutional terms, one can reconstruct his argument to mean broadly that in a humanly emancipated society, commonly owned property replaces private property, and that alienated political power no longer exists. The Communist Manifesto and the Revolutions of 1848. In his early writings and up to the period culminating in the revolutions of 1848, Marx intuits that the solution to the problem of class relations is intimately bound up with the solution to the problem of the relations between citizens and the state. He intuits further that the next revolution, the revolution to follow the French Revolution and complete the transition from political emancipation to human emancipation, would have to abolish class distinctions simultaneously with political hierarchies and bureaucracies. He reasons that while class distinctions prevail in civil society, and particularly in the economy, where the bourgeoisie buys labor power and the proletariat sells labor power, political alienation is perpetuated in the gulf between citizens and their government. Marx suggests that formal legal equality obtaining between citizens is undermined by the real inequality between those who buy and those who sell labor power in civil society. Since the step from political emancipation to human emancipation will be a unification of civil society and the state in a more legitimate form of political community than the parliamentary democratic republic, that more legitimate political form he has in mind is communism. Marx is sure that communism is the answer to the riddle of history and the key to squaring the manifest inequality between social classes and with the formal equality of citizens. During the 1840s, however, he is not quite sure about the precise path of the process culminating in communism as the first truly non-antagonistic form of socio-political and epistemological mediation between humanity and nature. The question is, does Marx see the arrival of communism primarily as a transition from political to human emancipation occurring in stages, or does he see it as a revolution that abolishes every form of alienated power in one stroke with the reappropriation of all of humanity's, quote, forces propres, end quote. This leads to the related question concerning the kind of new institutions that are to be operative in a new humanly emancipated society. The background to the Communist Manifesto, written with Marx's friend and political comrade Friedrich Engels, who lived from 1820 to 1895, is the democratic revolutions across Europe of 1848 and the attempt to carry on with renewed vigor the project initiated in France in 1789. The Manifesto is a political pamphlet taking up organizational and strategic questions rather than a theoretical work like On the Jewish Question. In addition to the now famous opening lines about the specter haunting Europe, Marx and Engels write, quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, and at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for the proletariat's help, and to drag the proletariat into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, the bourgeoisie furnishes the proletariat with the weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie." End quote. Two key passages follow in which the authors explain their position on the state and democracy in 1948. First, they define the state as nothing more than an executive committee for managing the affairs of the entire bourgeoisie. Second, they affirm that the proletariat must, quote, "win the battle of democracy," end quote. This leaves unanswered the question of peaceful reform or violent revolution, since winning the battle of democracy could be interpreted to mean replacing the representatives of other political parties with communists in the legislature. This is one plausible interpretation, given the at times positive remarks Marx makes about the potentially revolutionary dimension of universal suffrage and the possibility of applying the principle of, quote, "one person, one vote," end quote, to all areas of socioeconomic life which had once been the bastion of power, privilege, and inequality. It is also the case that in their written correspondence with friends and contemporaries, both Marx and Engels make reference to the possibility of arriving at communism through the ballot, especially in countries with no cumbersome aristocratic feudal heritage, such as Holland and the United States. Hence, the notion of winning the battle of democracy in the Communist Manifesto could be interpreted to imply a parliamentary democratic solution to the problem of the separation between state and civil society first systematically analyzed by Hegel. The implication of this solution is that there is nothing inherently capitalist about parliamentary democracy, and indeed this is the political position adopted later by the German social democratic politician Karl Kautsky, who lived from 1854 to 1938, and other leading figures in the international communist movement during Marx's day and after. At the end of the second section of the pamphlet, the authors assert, quote, "In the place of the old bourgeois society with its class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all," end quote. This can be seen as an attempt to formulate a positive response and program of action after the earlier critiques of Hegel and of political emancipation. In effect, they propose to revolutionize the locus of freedom. They want to shift the basis of freedom from liberal democratic non-infringement, in which each individual citizen is regarded as at best a possible trading partner and at worst a potential threat to the freedom of every other citizen, to positive community, in which each citizen recognizes in their fellow citizen the possibility of their own freedom and full development. The form of mediation between humanity and nature needs to make this emancipated form of community possible. The form of mediation between humanity and nature needed to make this emancipated form of community possible is one in which individuals recognize their creative powers in the actual products of their labor and not as in capitalism by passively receiving a generic wage in return for labor performed. It remained for Marx and Engels to continue outlining in more detail the most appropriate political form for the emancipation of human labor power from the capitalist wage system. Although they seem to accept that there is nothing essentially capitalist about the functioning of the modern state, they nonetheless also suggest that the new institution, which they refer to as a, quote, association, end quote, will at some point be a fully legitimate vehicle making collective decisions and adjudicating what little remains of conflict after private property has been replaced by commonly held property. It was theoretically and strategically important to concretize the issues in 1848. Following England's very early transition to parliamentary government and modern forms of capitalist production, the modern state was now entering a decisive phase of restructuring in key European countries such as France, Italy, and Germany. In France, the regional cultural differences between Brittany, Languedoc, Alsace, etc., were gradually being eradicated with the incorporation of the regions within a unified state claiming sovereignty over all of French territory and centrally administered from Paris under a republican ideology and the ideals of 1789. The Republican struggle against the Restoration forces attempting to retard this work of consolidation resulted in street barricades and parliamentary clashes, which inspired Italian and German patriots to press forward with their aims to unite Italy and Germany as independent nation-states. The articulation of Republican discourses about liberty in conjunction with democratic discourses concerning popular sovereignty at this time results in a constellation of concepts centered around nation, state, the people, sovereignty, and democracy. For partisans of national unification and Republican government, the democratic self-government of a sovereign people is thought to be achieved in a state where one state presupposes the existence of potentially hostile other states. Put in these terms, democracy within the borders of the emerging modern state is framed as a national question, that is, as a question of common legal concern for all people within the nation, regardless of their location in the class structure. Although Marx and Engels reject this idea of common national identity beyond the class divide, they have to engage with it in 1848 as part of the contradictory reality of class struggles in the bourgeois epoch of political emancipation. They favor working-class solidarity and internationalism, but this leaves a crucial question unanswered. What should the organized working class within the boundaries of the nation-state do in the immediate term? For it is here that elections and other concrete issues of political importance are fought out. Should the working class in different countries struggle for control of the state as if democracy, state gains, and communism are to be considered complementary political gains, or is international working class solidarity the more appropriate goal? In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels suggest that both a national and an international perspective is necessary, yet until the establishment of the first international in London in September 1864, the question of the coordination of the struggles remained provisional and tentative. It would in fact remain so as long as it was unclear exactly what winning the battle of democracy meant in theory as well as in practice. This entailed, among other things, explaining how, within the contradictions and limitations of a class-ridden society, the state could be replaced with a much more communal form of association. After some initial uncertainty and hesitation about how theoretically to grasp the relation between class, nation, state, and democracy in a way that best indicated the path to revolutionary practice, the experience of Bonapartism helped Marx and Engels define their position. From Bonapartism to the Paris Commune. In his writings on Bonapartism as a historical phenomenon connected with Louis Bonaparte, the younger cousin of the great leader Napoleon Bonaparte, Marx analyzes the changing structure of the relations between state and civil society, first culminating in the French Revolution of 1789 and then in the revolutions of 1848. These are transformational processes which confirm Marx's belief that, contrary to what Hegel argues, the efficacy of the mediating institutions in civil society has been definitively undermined. Not only does this depletion of the explicitly political character of civil society result in the sanction of the more exploitative aspects of civil life in a supposedly private and neutral sphere of legal equality, it also results in the emergence of the modern state as an independent entity that is alienated from popular control and entitled to reign over civil society as an autonomous force. The development of the state in this potentially authoritarian direction reaches a particularly acute phase with the tyrannical rule of Louis Bonaparte, which is the subject of Marx's brilliant analysis in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which covers the events of 1848 to 51 and the dictator's ascension to power. The study registers a decisive shift in Marx's thinking about politics and the state that anticipates some of the concerns of the theorists of Western Marxism. While in the Communist Manifesto, the state is dismissed as being nothing other than an executive committee for managing the affairs of the entire bourgeoisie, by the time of the 18th Brumaire, Marx develops a much more subtle analysis of the state and power relations among contending social classes. This more nuanced version of state theory implicitly recognizes what is problematic about the idea of, quote, winning the battle of democracy, end quote, if what is meant by this is putting the working class at the head of government, regardless of whether one considers the new government a state or an association. Marx's analysis of Bonapartism shows that at a particular junction of the class struggle, a stalemate in the relative power of each of the struggling classes in civil society can lead to a political situation in which the state can no longer be considered an executive committee or tool of the bourgeoisie. Instead, the state emerges as a political force in its own right, enjoying a certain degree of relative autonomy from class-based socioeconomic power. This increased room for maneuver of state institutions, and especially the executive, is likely to occur under modern conditions when divisions within the bourgeoisie between its agricultural, manufacturing, and financial sectors results in the inability of the bourgeois class as a whole to govern as a united force, thus allowing the state to assume control. This was acutely evident in the France of Louis Bonaparte's day, where the petite bourgeoisie was still a very numerous and powerful class and capable of defending its interests against the grand bourgeoisie as well as the emerging industrial proletariat. Marx argues that in order for the bourgeois elite to retain a certain measure of unity in such cases, it must sometimes relinquish a considerable part of its political power. In return, it gains from the state a pledge to intervene in an attempt to restore the social conditions necessary for the processes of accumulation and investment to resume, quote, normally, end quote. Marx goes on to focus his attention on the theoretical dimensions of those conditions in somewhat greater abstraction from actual historical events in his great works of political economy, such as the Grundrisse and Capital. In the 18th Brumaire, however, he demonstrates his ability as a historian to draw out the theoretical significance of socio-economic and political struggles. He points out that at particular historical junctures of the evolution of capitalism in specific countries, the grand bourgeoisie is likely to assent to a loss in political power if necessary, since by character and interest it is not a politically minded class. According to his analysis, it is a class that in many respects is fundamentally apolitical and almost entirely concerned with production and accumulation. As a consequence, it fails to see political crises coming, or at any rate does not manage to perceive them before it is too late. Marx argues that the bourgeoisie can be coaxed or forced to relinquish its political power because its raison d'etre is social and economic power and control. But civil society is a battle within and between classes, and the market is in reality not comparable to Adam Smith's invisible hand, which spontaneously coordinates supply and demand. Hence, the bourgeois elite occasionally needs a decidedly political state so that the bourgeois elite can go on being apolitical. Marx summarizes his analysis of Bonapartism by remarking that, quote, thus the French bourgeoisie was compelled by the French bourgeoisie's class position to annihilate on the one hand the vital conditions of all parliamentary power, including the bourgeoisie's own, and to render resistible, on the other hand, the executive power hostile to it, end quote. Marx has obviously come quite some distance from any simple conception of the state as a tool of the bourgeoisie. It follows that the notion of, quote, winning the battle of democracy, end quote, evoked in the Communist Manifesto needs to be rethought in light of the empirical and historical evidence that what one designates as the state is usually a complex network of fluid socio-economic and political relations. It is not a reified object that can be seized or smashed, or an executive committee that can be simply replaced with a new set of members. In fact, Marx's analysis in the 18th Brumaire anticipates some of the ideas of the Western Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who lived from 1891 to 1937, for whom the state can be understood as a flow of forces and interests that continually transgress the boundaries of state and civil society or base and superstructure. Marx and later Gramsci argue that power can be understood as something many-sided and protean, Protean. I read that word all the time, but I don't know how to say it. Although not crucially as something ontological or obscure that is not controlled or influenced and is wielded by any subject at all. For thinkers on the left associated with the labor movement such as Marx and Gramsci, there is no conflict between a sophisticated view of the relations obtaining between economy, state, and society on the one hand, and the political desideratum of a communist revolution on the other. The link between careful analysis and a clear path towards revolution becomes more tenuous in later years. 1 second. Gotta save something on my computer. Come on, you slow bitch. read that last sentence. For thinkers on the left associated with the labor movement, such as Marx and Gramsci, there is no conflict between a sophisticated view of the relations obtaining between economy, state, and society on the one hand and political desideratum of a communist revolution on the other. The link between careful analysis and a clear path towards revolution becomes more tenuous in later years in light of the authoritarian turn of the Russian Revolution and the stabilization of capitalism through the welfare state after World War II. This point will be taken up again in later chapters, particularly in Chapter 6. In his writing after the Communist Manifesto, Marx presented a highly nuanced and non-reductionist view of the state. He insists on viewing the state as a set of relations, and yet he warns observers of history and political activists not to reify or fetishize power. Like Machiavelli, who lived from 1469 to 1527, Marx retains the essential elements of political agency, i.e. of practice, in his analysis of power and his strategy for change. By jettisoning the view of the state in the Communist Manifesto and by showing how the state can achieve a certain measure of relative autonomy, Marx moves beyond the simple dichotomies suggested by the state civil society and base superstructure models and provides a key for understanding complex changes in forms of state. These will become much-needed tools for Gramsci and Lukács, who lived from 1885 to 1971, another key Western Marxist who will be discussed in Chapter 2. In the search to understand fascism in non-reductionist terms, Marx shows that in its quest to secure the conditions for the accumulation of capital and profitable investment, the bourgeoisie is prepared to sacrifice its political power at crucial junctures in the transition from one state form to another. In these transitional moments, class alliances are forged outside and even against the legislature, and then enforced by the executive of the modern state. What are the lessons of Bonapartism for Marx's theory of social classes, historical changes in state forms, and of revolution in the period following the events of 1789, 1848, and Bonaparte's coup in 1851? One of the lessons is summed up quite concisely in the preface to the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto. Here Marx and Engels write, quote, "One thing especially was proved by the Paris Commune, and that is, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield that ready-made state machinery for its own purposes," end quote. If the working class cannot lay hold of the existing state machinery and wield the existing state machinery for more universally legitimate purposes, smashing the state and building a new one on the ruins is not an option, since the state usually evolves historically over centuries and can only very rarely be toppled like a house of cards. This brings us to Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune, which, after the experiences of 1848 and Bonapartism, represents a decisive moment in his ideas about possible alternatives to constitutional monarchy and democratic republic. I need some water. All right, let's rock. When the Prussian army defeated the French in the War of 1871, the Prussians were shocked to find that a great number of citizens of Paris were not ready to yield to the invading troops. Indeed, the people of the city set up their own government based on radically democratic principles of collective self-government. The event fired Marx's imagination and became a central source of inspiration for Lenin living from 1870 to 1924, Lenin's State and Revolution, in which he argues that the role played by the Russian Soviets councils in 1905 and 1917 had been foreshadowed by the radical democracy institutionalized by the Paris Commune. The Commune gives Marx the chance to concretize his ideas about, quote, winning the battle of democracy, end quote. He argues that the Paris events indicate that the revolution in the offing would not be another instance of transferring state power from one set of oppressors to another. On the contrary, he maintains the modern state will be dismantled so that political authority can be wielded by ordinary citizens organized at the regional and local levels in communes. Hence, at this stage of his thinking, winning the battle of democracy becomes synonymous with democratizing the relations constituting the state, not smashing or seizing the state. What Marx glimpses in the Paris Commune is a new collective body capable of mediating people's concerns as workers with their concerns as citizens, that is, an association uniting the citizen and worker instead of separating manifestly unequal workers and capitalists in civil society from formally equal citizens in the state. For Marx, the great merit of the Commune was, however, briefly to have abolished the political realm as an alienated sphere of accountable power. This concern with the state and the danger of bureaucratic political power links Marx with the libertarian tradition examined in Chapter 4. That is, libertarians, like anarchists, consistently maintain that an anti-capitalist revolution won at the expense of accepting a highly centralized and authoritarian state is in fact a putsch rather than a genuine revolution. The communards paved the way by setting up a system of recall on demand so that the representatives of the people could be removed from their posts from the moment a majority of their electors deemed that the representatives' view no longer reflected the views of the represented. In Marx's estimation, the communards sought to fuse the executive and legislative functions of government. On the basis of his analysis of Bonapartism, Marx is convinced that popularly elected legislatures will always be undermined by non-accountable state executives as long as the executive itself is not integrated into a structure of popular control based on recall on demand. He reasons further that as long as the executive and legislative functions are separated, the popular elements in the legislature will inevitably be circumvented by extra-parliamentary alliances between powerful and well-organized interests amongst the large landowners, bureaucratic elites, the army, industry, police, and church. In today's world, one would certainly include institutions such as the media and the World Bank. Thus, in the France and Germany of Marx's day, and in many contemporary situations in Latin America, South America, Africa, and Asia, the work of the legislature is constantly undermined by extra-parliamentary forces, such that the legislature is severely limited in its ability to formulate something even vaguely resembling Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, Rousseau's notion of the general will. This is an important point, for it reveals that the practice of liberal democratic states generally falls well short of the liberal democratic criteria concerning reason and equality that supposedly underpin them. Despite what the best liberal democratic theorists from Locke, Kant, and Rousseau to the present say, the liberal democratic state is not founded on a fundamental form of agreement. This is not an indictment of the Enlightenment as such. It is indictment of what is ideologically heralded to be the already achieved aims of the Enlightenment. The project of highlighting the discrepancy between liberal democratic ideology and liberal democratic practice has been a central aim of the left in theory and practice in Europe from Marx to the present. It begins with Marx's critique of Hegel and the distinction between political and human emancipation analyzed in this chapter. It has been seen that what starts as a critique of philosophy and knowledge develops into an all-out critique of the economy, society, and state. The rest of this book thus analyzes a number of the most significant further developments in the articulation and rearticulation of the project to realize a positive conception of political liberty that is not authoritarian. Marx thinks that the genius of the communards consists, among other things, of replacing the standing professional army with a citizens' militia, so that the citizen body was now able to make laws, execute them, and defend the political community for which they had risked so much. Recall on demand is a measure of democratic control of primary importance. It ensures that government officials cannot become career politicians, and thereby nullify the aims of the Declaration of Man and Citizen proclaimed during the French Revolution and the founding of the modern state in France and elsewhere. Marx holds the idea of the professional politician in contempt and as incompatible with the principles of democracy, if that is, these are to be taken seriously. Marx explains that the existence and perpetuation of just such a professional caste is possible only when alienation has reached the stage where the state is perceived by the citizens as something external and distant from the average citizen. He concludes in 1870-71 that it is possible for the commune to become the standard form of government for even the smallest country towns. For Marx, it is the ideal political association for the self-government of the producers. Or, as he calls it in the Civil War in France, quote, the political form at last discovered to work out the economic emancipation of labor, end quote. Such an institution transforms the practice of universal suffrage into a far more effective means of giving expression to all of the wills comprising the general will than is ever possible in parliamentary regimes. The Russian Revolution and Marx's contested legacy. The Communist Manifesto, the 18th Brumaire, and the Civil War in France, all of which are extensively cited by Lenin, raise a number of theoretical questions that were to become matters of immense practical difficulty during the years of Bolshevik rule in the former Soviet Union. While Marx's critique of existing political arrangements is radically democratic, the actual means for abolishing the division between mental and manual labor and reorganizing the labor process are not discussed in any detail. Without being unfair to Marx, it is safe to say that he believed that the historical process destined to culminate in human emancipation would resolve theoretical questions of revolutionary consciousness and practical questions of organization. As will be seen in Chapter 4 and 5, the libertarian, situationist, and autonomous traditions in Europe are keenly aware of these problems, especially in the light of Bolshevik authoritarian etatism. Etatism. That's probably how you say it. Marx's earlier philosophical concern with human as opposed to merely political emancipation wanes in the more mature historical writings. In the wake of Bonapartism, Marx focused his critical energies on the manifestly non-democratic aspects of the modern state. This shift in emphasis subsequently helps Lenin portray Marx to his Russian comrades as a thinker and activist primarily concerned with explaining the necessity to destroy the democratic parliamentary state and to establish, if need be, a highly authoritarian transition to communism. The tendency towards authoritarianism is exacerbated in Lenin's case by his tendency to regard the economic organization of communism mainly as consisting in taking over the productive apparatus left by capitalism and simply socializing it. The idea that socialized nationalization of the ownership of the forces of production is not the same thing as worker autonomy and self-management is something the Bolshevik leader usually dismisses as syndicalism or anarchism. This is not the case in State and Revolution, but increasingly becomes so in the struggle for power, eventually resulting in the construction of a one-party state. While State and Revolution, written in 1917, praises the Paris Commune and the Russian Soviets, Lenin's writings on workplace democracy after the establishment of the Third International in March 1919 tend to stress the need for rapid industrialization and forms of management appropriate to that gigantic task. One must also not forget that the war against reactionary right-wing forces was still raging in the early 1920s and that the conditions for workplace democracy and laying the foundations of human emancipation were not available. Nonetheless, a couple of observations are relevant in this context. Lenin interprets Marx and Engels as meaning that since the working class cannot lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield the ready-made state machinery for its own purposes, the working class, hierarchically organized in the Communist Party, which in the Russian conditions of the day had to operate in secrecy and in exile for much of the time leading up to the February Revolution of 1917, must smash the state, including the popular power represented in the legislature. Thus, from the anarchist and syndicalist perspectives to be explored in Chapter 4, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were merely continuing the work of Robespierre, who lived from 1758 to 1794, and the Jacobins rather than reversing the centralist tendencies of modern states. The link between the Paris Commune and the role of the Soviets in the 1905 revolution and the revolutions of February and October 1917 began to fade, as the Communist Party became the sole source of political authority. Lenin and others attempting to understand and update Marx continually came back to two key points in the Civil War in France. First, the existing state machinery had to be transformed into a network of communes. Second, production had to be reorganized by transforming private property into social, publicly owned property. This raises the question, how can a federation of radically democratic and decentralized communes be reconciled with a gigantic and highly centralized productive planning apparatus? The Communist Party could preside over the centralized direction of the economy, but to this extent, however, the party would then constitute a major obstacle to the radical form of decentralized democratic accountability between representatives and represented suggested by the practice of the Paris Commune and later by the Russian Soviets. In State and Revolution, Lenin clumsily attempts to balance the respective roles of the party, unions, and Soviets so that the imperatives of political leadership are reconciled with demands for direct participation on the factory floor, army, regiment, and city district, not to mention the enormous question raised by the role of the peasants. Although the conspiratorial organizational model suggested by Lenin's What Is to Be Done, published in 1902, seems to by 1917 to have given way to a more council-based vision of the revolution, the post-1917 writings seem to shift back to a party-based model. It is extremely difficult to ascertain with certainty whether the ravages of the Civil War compelled Lenin to take these steps towards institutionalization of discipline and hierarchy against his will. It is also very difficult to determine whether the foundations of the cult of personality and the power of the secret police were already laid in the period of Lenin's leadership of the Bolsheviks, or whether Stalin, who lived from 1879 to 1953, managed to do this single-handedly. What is clear is that after Lenin's death in 1924, a power struggle ensued, which eventually led to Stalin's control of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the bureaucratic and authoritarian degeneration of the Russian Revolution. With the failure of the revolution in Russia to offer a desirable alternative to capitalism and parliamentary democracy and the looming threat of fascism in Italy, beginning in 1922, and later Germany, Italy 1922, and later Germany 1933, and Spain 1936 to 37, a number of thinkers and revolutionaries broadly affiliated with a current called Western Marxism began to see that it was necessary to go back and reinvestigate Marx's ideas on the base and superstructure, as well as the Hegelian basis of Marxist thought. Chapter 2 turns to the most important thinkers and movements connected with Western Marxism.